So chapter 17 focuses on the blood. Chapter 18 focuses on the heart, and chapter 19 is all on vessels. So these three chapters go together really well. We're going to start off in chapter 17, talking about things like blood composition. So what are the parts and pieces that we find within the blood? There is a non-living component to your blood called blood plasma. This is a liquid component, so we're going to talk more about that. We also have formed elements in our blood. These are the cells. This is the stuff that we find in our blood. And this includes three things. It includes red blood cells, which we call for short RBCs or erythrocytes. These are going to carry oxygen. That is the big job of a red blood cell. We have white blood cells or WBCs. We also call these leukocytes. And these are basically your immune system. They are there to provide you with immunity and to protect your body from foreign organisms, foreign antigens. So they are there for protection. And then platelets. Platelets are actually little fragments of a bigger cell, and the job of a platelet is to help with blood clotting. So as we move through chapter 17, we are really going to dig down into not just the plasma, but also we'll talk a lot about our formed elements. We'll talk about how they're created. We'll talk about how long they live in the body, what they do. We'll really dig deep into each of those formed elements. Another thing that we'll address in chapter 17 is this concept of hemostasis. Notice I said hemostasis, not homeostasis. Heme means blood and stasis means to stop. So hemostasis is essentially the process of blood clotting. This is an incredibly complicated process. It is a cascade reaction. It's about 30 reactions that are involved in the process of blood clotting. It is so complicated because you don't want your blood to clot unless you really need it to clot. If you form blood clots when you don't need them, they can be dangerous. They can be life-threatening. So we'll walk through blood clotting hemostasis. We'll also talk about blood groups. So we'll talk about the ABO blood groups. We'll talk about blood typing, and we'll even talk about transfusions, which is, if you need to get blood, you want to make sure that your blood type matches. And we'll talk about what happens if it doesn't. And we call that a transfusion reaction. And then the last thing we'll talk about in chapter 17 is we'll talk about a couple of different diagnostic blood tests. These are things that a doctor might perform depending on your symptoms. So before we really dig into blood and the parts and pieces of blood, I do want to talk a little bit about how blood circulates through the body. This is something that we'll touch on a lot more in chapters 18 and 19. But you can see here that we have an image with the heart, and below the heart is a picture of a body. And you can see that is the systemic circuit. And then above the heart is an image of the lungs, and we call that the pulmonary circuit. So basically, the blood flow throughout your body is divided into these two circuits. The systemic circuit, you can think like organ system. This is going to supply blood to all of your organ systems. And then the pulmonary circuit, which is actually going to help to add oxygen to your blood. So I always remember pulmonary lungs. So let's really focus in here on the systemic circuit. And what you're going to notice is that the blood is leaving the heart, and the blood that's leaving the heart is nice, red, oxygen-rich, nutrient-rich blood. And it's going to leave the heart through arteries. Now, I always remember artery starts with A, so I remember artery away. Arteries are going to carry the blood away from the heart. Okay, and they're going to branch and get smaller and smaller and eventually turn into microscopic capillaries. And those capillary beds are going to feed your tissues, they're going to feed your organ systems, and they're going to supply the oxygen and the nutrients to all of your tissues. You're also going to take all the waste, all the metabolic waste that your cells are producing, all the CO2, that is actually going to get picked back up by those capillary beds, and it's going to be brought back to the heart through veins. Now notice the veins here are blue in color, and typically blue is going to represent spent blood. It's blood that does not have any oxygen anymore. It does not have nutrients. And so essentially through your body, through the systemic circuit, your heart pumps out this nice oxygen-rich blood. It feeds all of your tissues and organs. You pick up all the waste and you bring it back to your heart. And then if we look at the pulmonary circuit, this is how we're basically taking that spent blood, that blue blood that has no oxygen in it, and we're going to send it out to our lungs. Again, it's leaving the heart, so it's following an artery going away from the heart. It's going to go out to our lungs. We're going to fill it up with oxygen, and we're going to bring it back to the heart through those veins. Okay, so these are our pulmonary and our systemic circuits. So what is your blood composed of? Your blood is a connective tissue. And so I'm going to share with you a whiteboard because we talked about connective tissues in Anatomy 1. And if you'll remember, there are 4 kinds of connective tissues. Connective tissue proper. There is cartilage, bone, and that last one is blood. These are our 4 connective tissues. And if you'll remember, connective tissue proper, this is going to be like tendons and ligaments. Cartilage, this is that hard stuff that wraps around the ends of all of your long bones. It helps to protect from wear and tear at those joints. Our bone, obviously, is connective tissue, and then last one is blood. The main function of all 4 connective tissues is to connect things together, right? Tendons and ligaments, cartilage, bone, and blood. Now, your book says that blood is an atypical connective tissue, right? If we look at these 4 types of tissues, that blood is basically not like the others. It's a liquid. I would say that your blood is probably the best connective tissue that we have because it does a great job of connecting everything in your body together. Okay, so let's go back to that PowerPoint now that we can remember that blood is a connective tissue. Let's talk about the parts and pieces of blood, right? So I already mentioned it has plasma. That is the non-living fluid matrix. So remember, all your connective tissues have an extracellular matrix. They have fibers and ground substances within that extracellular matrix. And then they have the living component. They have the cells, right? So we would say that plasma is the extracellular matrix. It's a fluid matrix. It's not living. Then we also have formed elements. And the formed elements are basically the cells. This is the living component. Now, the reason why cells is in quotation marks is because of these 3 formed elements that are listed here, only one of them is actually a complete cell, and that is your white blood cells, those leukocytes. White blood cells are complete cells. They have all the organelles. They have a nucleus. Again, these are involved in your immune system. They help to protect against foreign organisms, foreign antigens. Now, the other 2 that are listed here, red blood cells and platelets, these are actually not complete cells. Red blood cells, or we also call them erythrocytes, their job is to carry oxygen. They actually don't have a nucleus. The nucleus has been removed from a red blood cell. Now, without a nucleus, that means a red blood cell cannot go through the process of division or mitosis and create more. Your red blood cells are actually formed in your red bone marrow. Platelets are also not complete cells. These are little fragments of a larger cell called a megakaryocyte. So platelets, again, these are involved in blood clotting. So if we look at our 3 formed elements, the only one that's an actual complete cell are those white blood cells. Now, if we look at your blood, if we were to draw blood from a patient and spin it down in a centrifuge, right, similar to this image that we're looking at here, what we would find is that the heavy stuff is going to sink to the bottom. So the heavy stuff is going to be the formed elements. So what we see at the very bottom are the heaviest. That's going to be your red blood cells. Red blood cells make up about 45% of your blood volume, so a little less than half. Plasma, is the liquid, is going to be the lightest. That's going to float on top. That is this yellow straw colored material, and it makes up a little over half of your blood volume. About 55% of your blood volume is plasma. And then you can kind of see sandwiched here right in the middle, that little line across there, that's called the buffy coat. And that is white blood cells and platelets. And that makes up less than 1% of your blood volume. All right, so let's go back. And that's exactly what this slide tells you here. So the plasma, which is on top, it's the lightest, that straw colored material is a little more than half. Red blood cells are at the very bottom. They're the heaviest. They're a little less than half, 45%. And then white blood cells and platelets, that buffy coat, make up less than 1%. Now this term here, you're going to see this a lot as we move through the chapter. Your hematocrit is the percent of blood volume that is red blood cells. Now, again, a normal hematocrit, you can see here, erythrocytes, red blood cells, make up about 45%. In reality, that's kind of an average number. For men, males, their normal hematocrit is typically slightly higher at 47%. And for females, it's slightly lower at 42%. And what makes that difference has a lot to do with testosterone levels. Men typically have a higher testosterone level than females, in which case they're going to have a higher hematocrit. They'll have more red blood cells. Now, a couple of physical characteristics. This is just, if you've ever seen blood, these characteristics should look very familiar. Blood is sticky. It is not see-through, it is opaque, and it has a very metallic iron kind of taste to it because it does have iron in it. The color of your blood is anything from a really bright red, if it has a lot of oxygen in it, to a darker, more purplish hue if it does not have a lot of oxygen. You can tell when you look at lips. You have very superficial capillaries here, and so your lips have a red color. If someone is not breathing or not getting enough oxygen, their lips can turn blue. That's because your blood can change color if it doesn't have enough oxygen in it, and it'll have more of a blue tinge to it. Blood is thicker than water because it has stuff in it, right? It has these formed elements. It has red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. The pH of blood is around neutral, so it's 7.35 to 7.45. And you actually have buffers in your blood to maintain that very specific blood pH. There are times that you can overload those buffers. Alcohol poisoning is a great example. Alcohol has a very low pH, a pH of about 1. So when someone drinks in excess, we know that alcohol moves right into the bloodstream. And that very low pH alcohol can actually overload your blood buffers and cause your blood pH to drop. And if it drops below 7.35, we call that acidosis, and that is life-threatening. So someone can die from that. Your blood is about 8% of your body weight. And typically we have about 5 liters of blood in our body. So think about, I put a little, a liter bottle of Coke up here, not a 2-liter bottle, but a liter bottle of Coke. You have about 5 of those filled with blood. Now, we don't typically refer to the amount of blood we have as liters. Instead, we talk about it in terms of units. So we have 5 liters, or roughly 10 units of blood. So each unit of blood is about a half of a liter. And that's for an adult. A newborn has only about 1 cup of blood. So it does not take much for a newborn to become dehydrated or to lose too much blood volume. So this is why it is so important that we make sure that for newborn babies that they are having wet diapers, that they're going to the bathroom, they're not getting dehydrated. Now, you probably have heard of people having traumatic accidents or even having surgery and having to have blood put back in. And a lot of times, I just told you we have 10 to 12 units of blood. Depending on the surgery or depending on how much blood you are losing, you may have to have more than 10 to 12 units of blood put back in your body. Some examples would be burn patients. If you have a 3rd-degree burn over a majority of your body, you may have to be given a pretty ample supply of blood, up to 20 units of blood. Your liver holds a tremendous amount of blood. So when patients have liver transplants, they're given upwards of 40 units of blood. Heart surgeries, depending on the type of surgery, it can be 6 or more units of blood. And then traumatic accidents, patients can be given 50 or more units of blood. Now, I also want to walk you through just a little bit the functions of blood. Blood does a lot of things for us. One, obviously, it's a connective tissue, so it connects things together in your body. So that makes it a great substance for distribution. It distributes oxygen, nutrients, CO2, wastes. It does a wonderful job at moving hormones through your body. So blood is a really essential connective tissue. It is also involved in regulation. Blood can help to regulate your body temperature. When you are cold, your vessels that are in your extremities, like your hands and your feet, they will constrict and get small. They will shunt that blood closer to your core to keep your core temperature elevated. When you're hot, the opposite happens. The vessels in your extremities will dilate, get bigger, so that you can help to evaporatively cool your body. I notice a lot, like if it's hot outside and I go for a walk or I exercise or I cut the grass, I'll notice like my fingers will swell, they'll get bigger. And that's just because you're pumping more blood to your extremities. Your blood regulates pH, and also fluid volume can be regulated by your blood as well. And we'll talk more about that as we move through this chapter. Your blood is great at protection, right? We've mentioned white blood cells, how they help with immunity, so they prevent infection. But also, we may not think about blood clotting as a protective mechanism. If your blood can't clot, then you would lose too much blood. So blood clotting is incredibly important. Now, I'm going to walk you through blood plasma in only one slide. Blood plasma is the liquid stuff. It is about 90% water. So it is mostly water. It's the non-living component of our blood. But even though it's mostly water, it has a ton of dissolved solutes in it. Anything from nutrients, wastes, gases, hormones, electrolytes, and even proteins. So I have proteins starred and I have them in bold here. And the reason is they are the most abundant by weight. So we have a lot of proteins in our blood plasma. Plasma proteins actually stay in the blood. They're never taken up by cells used as fuel. So what do I mean by that? Let's open up a whiteboard and let's clear this one off. And let's talk about that. So this should look very familiar to you. Carbohydrates plus oxygen forms CO2, water, and ATP. Okay, that is cell respiration, right? So this is how your cells use nutrients like carbohydrates and oxygen. And in the process, they create energy, right? And what do we need energy for? Everything. You need it for cells to divide, for glands to secrete, for muscles to contract, for nerves to fire. You need energy for everything in the body. So you actually make your own body weight in ATP every day. You burn it as fast as you make it. So we take food stuff and oxygen and convert that into energy. Right. And in the process, we're going to create waste. We're going to create waste like CO2 and water. Okay. So when I say that plasma proteins stay in your blood and they're not used to create energy, they're not used by cells in this process. What I mean by that, and I write this equation very simply so you can remember it, right, is that, you eat more than carbs, right? But let's say if you don't have enough carbohydrates, the next thing that your body is going to burn for fuel to make energy are lipids. If you don't have enough lipids, well, you can use protein. Right? And we'll talk more about this as we talk about nutrition, but this is kind of why low carb, no carb diets work really well. It's because if you're not eating a lot of carbohydrates, then what your body is going to burn to make energy is going to be lipids. So you'll lose a tremendous amount of fat or adipose tissue as you're making that energy. So what I mean when we talk about these plasma proteins, when I say that they're not ever going to be used by your cells to make energy, is you would never use plasma proteins to create that ATP. Okay. Those are going to stay in your blood. So let's go back to our screen here. Most plasma proteins are actually produced by the liver. We have plasma proteins are divided up into classified as albumins. 60% of our plasma proteins are albumins. These help with blood buffering. They help with transporting things within our blood. They help to maintain a pressure, a blood pressure. We will talk so much more about that in chapter 19. 36% of our plasma proteins are globulins like alpha, beta, and gamma globulins. These can include things like antibodies. And then 4% is fibrinogen. Fibrinogen is a plasma protein that is essential in blood clotting. It almost looks like a spider web when it is formed, okay? So that is our blood plasma. Those are our plasma proteins. So what we're going to spend most of our time on in this chapter is talking a lot about not our plasma, but our formed elements, our red blood cells, our white blood cells, and our platelets, right? So remember our white blood cells, we call them leukocytes. And again, remember, these are the only complete cell in our blood. You can see in the image on the right, the leukocytes. These are sort of these orange colored structures in this particular image. We also have red blood cells or erythrocytes. These are not complete cells. They do not have a nucleus. They make up just about half of our blood volume, just under half of our blood volume. If we look at erythrocytes, you can see it's going to be the majority of what you see in here, which are these red cells. Now, notice the way they look. To me, they remind me of a cert, you know, the mints certs, not a lifesaver with a hole, but the cert has like a little divot in the middle. And that's what those look like to me. They have that divot because the nucleus is no longer present. So they're kind of sunken down in the middle. We're going to talk about why that's important, why the overall structure of that red blood cell having that divot in the middle actually helps with its function, which is to carry oxygen. And then we also have platelets, and platelets are basically little fragments of cells. So they're not complete cells either. They honestly look like little debris under the microscope. If you look at a blood stain under a scope, it looks like dirt. And so you can see the platelets here in this picture. They're tiny, and they're incredibly important in helping your blood clot. Most of our formed elements live in the bloodstream for a few days, 3 months at most. And our blood cells originate in our bone marrow. So they're actually coming from our red bone marrow, which hopefully you remember from Anatomy 1. Red bone marrow is stored in the hollow spaces of your bones. Okay. Most of your blood cells, they also don't divide on their own, right? If they're not a complete cell, they can't go through mitosis. If they don't have a nucleus, like a red blood cell, it can't go through mitosis. This is another great image. This is a blood smear, and you can see white blood cells. White blood cells are typically really big, and you can see that dark nucleus, right? So you can see a white blood cell here and here and here and here. Red blood cells are much more numerous, right? They're making up roughly half of our blood volume, and you can see all those red blood cells. And it almost looks like in the middle of those red blood cells, it almost looks transparent because, again, their structure, they're kind of sunken down in the middle. And then over here, there's that debris over here. Those are our platelets that help with clotting. All right, in the next lecture, we will pick up with erythrocytes, and we will talk about those red blood cells and dig a little deeper into how they are formed, how long they live, and talk a little bit about hemoglobin.